I don't need a companion, Reid Larkin said, the moment Faye Colton stepped down from Dan's wagon into the dust of the Larkin yard. I need someone who can keep accounts and not flinch when the work gets loud. Faye had ridden 3 hours from Casper in a wagon with no cushion, and a driver who had spent the entire journey looking at her sideways, the way people do when they're revising what they'd expected. She had a single trunk, a carpet bag, a letter folded soft at the creases from too much rereading, and 28 years of knowing when a man was speaking from fear rather than conviction. Reid Larkin was speaking from fear. His jaw said otherwise. His jaw was granite and deliberate and entirely unconvincing to anyone paying attention. "Where are the books?" Faye said. A pause, small enough to matter. "Inside," he said. "Dan will get your things." He turned and walked back toward the forge, and she let herself look at the yard properly. The blacksmith shop with its red glow visible even in midday. The house that had good bones and not enough care, a kitchen garden gone scraggly at the edges, and hanging in the window of the front room, barely visible, a hand-stitched curtain. Somebody had made that curtain, somebody who cared about the light. She picked up her carpet bag herself and went inside. The house was not empty in the way an abandoned house is empty. It was empty the way a place is empty when the person who gave it its particular warmth is no longer quite the same. There were signs of a life that had once run fuller than this. Dried herbs bunched at the kitchen beam, a hand-pieced quilt folded over the parlor chair, 2 coffee cups on the shelf where there was now only one in regular use. And on the mantle, sitting next to a clock that still ran, a brass compass, scratched and dulled with years, lying on its side as if it had been set down in haste and never picked back up. Blythe Larkin was in the parlor, wrapped in a shawl, watching Faye come in with the particular alertness of a woman who had learned to read people quickly because movement had become difficult, and she couldn't always get up to check for herself. She was perhaps 65. Her hands knotted with what was clearly a bad winter's rheumatism, her eyes sharp and a color between gray and green. "You're younger than Reid said," Blythe said. "He mentioned me," Faye asked. "He said you were capable." Blythe's mouth moved in a way that suggested the word capable had told her more than Reid had intended. "Sit down. I'll have him bring your trunk up later. He won't think of it himself." Faye sat. "The letter said you've been unwell." "The letter," Blythe said, "understated the case. I have good days and bad days, and on the bad days, this house forgets it needs running. Reid keeps the forge going and the cattle counted and everything else falls." She looked at Faye levelly. He was not always like this. Faye did not ask what he had been like before. She had learned that the most informative thing you could do in a stranger's house was to be quiet and let it tell you. She got the books that afternoon, and what she found in them was not carelessness. It was something worse, a man who had stopped believing his work was worth what it cost. Reid charged a fair rate for horseshoe sets, for wheel repairs, for custom ironwork, fair by the standard of 5 years ago, before the price of coal had shifted, before 3 new ranches had moved into the county and needed steady smith work. He had not adjusted. He had not noticed, or had noticed and had not bothered, which amounted to the same problem from a different direction. She said nothing about it at supper. She had learned from watching her father lose a small printing business in Cincinnati that the worst thing you could do was tell a man what he'd done wrong before he trusted you enough to hear it. She made supper from what was in the larder. A decent larder, she noted. Someone had been keeping it stocked, and she set the table neatly, and she put a jar of water in the middle the way her mother always had, because her mother had believed that a table set with care told whoever sat down at it that they were worth the effort. Reid came in from the forge at 6:15. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw the table set. She kept her back to him and stirred the pot. "Beans," he said. "And salt pork," she said. "There's cornbread if you want it." He sat down without another word, ate steadily, not quickly, the way a man eats when his body needs it and his mind is somewhere else entirely. She ate across from him and did not try to make conversation, because forced conversation was its own kind of violence, and she had never had patience for it. It was Reid who spoke first. He said, "You read the books." "You put me on the accounts," she said. "And?" She looked at him. He was looking at the table. "I'll tell you tomorrow," she said. "It'll keep one night." He glanced up. She had the impression he had expected her to tell him he was doing it wrong. and the fact that she hadn't had confused him in a way he wasn't ready to show. "All right," he said. They finished in silence. She washed up. He went back to the forge. She sat at the kitchen table with the books for another 2 hours, her careful handwriting in the margins, the lamp pulling shadows across the page, and the Wyoming night pressing against the glass with that particular weight that comes from skies that are simply larger than anything you grew up under. The first week was an education, not in the way she had expected. She had expected to learn the routine of the house, the rhythm of the forge, the particular silences of a man she was still working out how to read, and she did learn all of that. But what surprised her was learning Dan Hughes, who managed the small cattle operation, and had apparently been watching Reid Larkin since long before Faye arrived with the eyes of a man who knew something was wrong, and didn't know how to fix it. Dan was 50, wiry, with a dry humor he deployed at careful intervals. On her third day, he found her in the kitchen garden pulling dead growth, which she was doing because the garden needed it, and because working with her hands helped her think. He stood at the fence with his hat in his hands. "Most women who come out here last about a week." "Is that so?" Faye said. "The solitude gets them, or the cold." Or he tilted his head toward the forge. "Read." "I've met difficult men before," she said pleasantly. "He's not difficult," Dan said. "That's the part that makes it hard. He used to be the easiest man in this county to be around. Before, he stopped. Well, before." "Before what?" she asked, straightening up. Dan looked at the forge for a moment. His brother Thomas came home from the war in a pine box. Reid went to get him, took the body all the way back himself, 3 days' ride, wouldn't let anyone else do it. Came back different. He turned his hat over in his hands. Not mean, not broken, just removed, like he'd decided to live at a distance from everything. He looked at her, but he wrote that letter. First time in 4 years he's done anything that could be called reaching out. Faye went back to the garden. "Hand me that trowel, please." Dan handed it over. Then he stayed and helped her clear the far row, and they worked in the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill space with sound. And after a while he said, "You're going to stay, aren't you?" "I haven't decided to leave," she said. He nodded once, as if that answered a different question than the one he'd asked. The conversation about the books happened on the 8th day. She had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment turned out to be a Tuesday afternoon, when Reid came in from the forge unexpectedly at 2 o'clock with a particular tight set to his jaw that she had already learned meant something wasn't right, and she looked at him and said, "Sit down. We should talk about the accounts." He stood in the kitchen doorway. "I'm not in the mood." "You're charging 1872 prices for work that cost you 1878 prices to produce," she said. "The gap is not large on any individual job. Across the course of a year, it has been significant enough that you can't take on a hired hand. You've been delaying the roof repair on the east barn for 2 seasons, and your margin on the Hendricks contract is approximately nothing." She set the ledger on the table and turned it toward him. "You are not a failing business. You are a successful business that has been slowly starving itself." He came into the kitchen. He stood over the ledger, not sitting, looking at what she'd marked. "How did you do that?" he said. "I read the books," she said. "And then I read the county supply records at the land office in Casper last week, which are public record, and compared what raw materials actually cost against what you're paying and what you're charging." She paused. "You've been paying fair prices to your suppliers and charging unfair prices to your customers. Unfair to yourself, I mean." He was quiet. "Why?" she asked. It was a direct question, and she knew it. He looked at her, and for a moment she thought he would close off, would go flat and impenetrable the way he did when something came too close to the center of things. Instead he said, after Thomas, he stopped, started again. It felt like a lot to ask, for things, money, fair treatment. His voice was even, the way a voice is even when it is covering something with deliberate effort. It stopped seeming like something I had a right to. The kitchen was very still. Faye chose her next words carefully. "What happened to Thomas?" Reid looked at the compass on the mantle. She had noticed him look at it before, not often, but in the particular way people look at things they are both drawn to and trying not to touch. "Cold Harbor," he said. "June of '64. He was 23. He was quiet for a moment. Thomas was the one who knew how to be in a room, how to make things easy. He'd walk into a place, and inside 10 minutes everybody felt like they'd known him their whole life. His jaw worked. I was always the one who could work. He was the one who could live. Faye did not say she was sorry. She had found that sorry, however sincerely meant, had a way of closing things back down. She said, "How long did you carry him?" Reid looked at her. 3 days, she said quietly. Dan told me. Something moved in his face. Not grief exactly. Grief, she was learning, had been in this house so long it had become a kind of wallpaper, ever present, mostly invisible until the light hit it wrong. What moved across his face was something more immediate. The surprise of being seen. 3 days, he confirmed. That's a long way to carry someone, she said. He looked at the compass for another moment. Then he crossed the kitchen, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the numbers she'd marked. "Show me what you'd charge," he said. She pulled up a chair beside him and showed him. He listened with the same quality of attention she'd noticed the first time they'd talked about anything that mattered to him. Focused, specific, pushing back on the details that needed pushing back on. He was, she realized, considerably sharper than his silences suggested. The silence wasn't dullness. It was conservation. He didn't spend attention on things that didn't matter, which meant that when something did matter, all of it was there. When they finished, he sat back, looked at the revised margin. "Hendricks won't like it," he said. "Hendricks has been getting good ironwork at 1872 prices for 6 years, she said. He'll pay the new rate or he'll find someone who does worse work and pay that rate instead. Either way, it's an honest arrangement." Reid made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It had the shape of one, brief and caught at the back of the throat, but hadn't been used enough lately to come out all the way. "Write up the new schedule," he said. "I'll sign it." She wrote it that evening. He signed it without reading it again, which told her, more than anything else, that he had decided to trust her. Not completely, not yet, but enough. And in a place as guarded as Reid Larkin had become, enough was something. The railroad agent arrived on a Wednesday. His name was Prescott, and he came in a city suit and a manner polished to the smooth finish of a man accustomed to being the most educated person in any room he entered. He came to the forge rather than the house, which told Faye he'd done his research, and knew Reid was more likely to be caught off guard mid-work than at his own table. She saw the buggy from the kitchen window, and something in the quality of Prescott's movements, the particular ease of a man about to make an offer he assumed would be accepted, made her take off her apron and walk out. Reid was at the anvil when Prescott made his case. Northern Continental Railroad had filed a right-of-way survey across the eastern edge of the Larkin property. The survey, Prescott explained pleasantly, had already been filed at the Territorial Land Office. The company would, of course, compensate fairly. He mentioned a number. Reid set down his hammer. He looked at Prescott with the same expression he used for everything he had not yet decided how to feel about. "What do you mean, already filed?" "The survey is a matter of public record," Prescott said. "The company filed it in August. You would have received formal notification by post." "I received a letter in August," Reid said. "It looked like a solicitation. I set it aside." Prescott's expression did not change. "Nonetheless," he said, "the right-of-way is established. The question is simply the compensation arrangement." That evening, Reid set the August letter, still unopened, which Faye had found in a stack on the office shelf, on the kitchen table and looked at it. She read it. Then she said, "Give me 3 days." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Read the survey," she said. The Casper Land Office kept public records, and Faye had already learned where they were and how to ask for them in a way that made the clerk feel helpful rather than interrogated. She spent all of Thursday with the railroad's survey filing, and the original Larkin homestead deed spread across the reading table, working through the property line descriptions with a focus that made the young clerk leave her entirely alone. The survey was thorough. Prescott's company had done careful work, but careful work built on the wrong assumption produces careful errors, and the assumption Prescott's surveyors had made, that the eastern boundary of the Larkin property ran along the creek line as it stood today, was incorrect. 40 years of seasonal flood had shifted that creek 17 feet west of where it had run when Reid's grandfather filed the original homestead claim. The right-of-way the railroad had surveyed ran not through the edge of Larkin land, but through the middle of it, through the east pasture, through the access road to the south barn. Through, she noted, the spring-fed well that watered the cattle in dry months. She sat with that for a long time. Then she went looking at the other property filings along the proposed spur line. 2 neighboring homesteads showed the same discrepancy. Right-of-way claims that, measured against original deed boundaries, cut deeper into private land than the railroad's public statements had indicated. Not malicious, perhaps. Just a survey team that hadn't looked at historical records before filing. But the effect was the same. She brought Reid a map that evening, drawn in her own hand. Original property lines in one ink, the railroad's claimed corridor in another. He looked at it for a long time. "The survey is wrong," she said, "not by a little." He traced the line with one finger. "How did you see this?" "Your grandfather's deed has a creek marker as the eastern boundary," she said. "I went and looked at the creek." She paused. "I also asked Dan where the old bank used to be. He knew." Reid looked up. "Dan's been on this land longer than you have," she said. He remembered. Something moved through Reid's face. Not the near law from the kitchen, but something quieter and heavier. "Prescott's coming back Friday," Reid said. "Write to a land attorney in Cheyenne tonight," she said. "I have the name of one who's handled homestead boundary disputes before. We need someone who can file a formal survey dispute before the railroad can act on their claim." He looked at the map again, at the line running through his east pasture, his access road, his well. "Why do you care?" he said. And it was the same baffled honesty she might have expected, the genuine confusion of a man who had not yet accepted that someone might choose to be in his corner without being owed something. "You've been here 12 days. "I've been here 12 days, she said, "and I have never been someone who could see something going wrong and decide it wasn't her business." She held his gaze. "This is my business, Reid. This is my home." She said it simply, the way you say a thing when you've decided it's true and don't see any reason to soften it. He was very still. "All right," he said. "I'll write tonight." He did. Faye helped him draft it, and at the end he signed it with the same unhesitating hand with which he'd signed the new rate schedule, and she thought, that's what trust looks like in a man who doesn't have words for it. It looks like handing over the pen. Prescott came back Friday at 10 in the morning. This time he came to the front door. Reid answered it, and Faye stood at Reid's shoulder in the doorway, because she had decided this was where she should be. Prescott's eyes moved to her and registered her presence with the quick recalibration of a man who had expected a different scene. "The survey dispute is already filed," Reid said. "A land attorney in Cheyenne filed it this morning on our behalf. The original homestead boundary markers show your right-of-way claim runs through the center of our east pasture, not the edge. There are 2 other properties along your proposed route with the same discrepancy." Prescott was quiet for a moment. The folder was still under his arm. "That process can take considerable time," Prescott said. "It can," Reid agreed. "We're prepared to wait." Prescott's gaze moved back to Faye. She met it without adjusting her expression. "Your wife?" he said. "Yes," Reid said. He said it the way he said everything that mattered to him, without decoration, without emphasis, in the flat, certain tone of a man stating a fact he has decided to stop keeping to himself. Prescott left. They stood in the doorway until the buggy was out of the yard, and then Reid turned and went back inside, and Faye followed, and they stood in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the curtains someone had once made with care. "He'll push back through channels," Faye said. "He will," Reid said. "We'll push back through channels." She turned to put the kettle on, and she was aware of him still standing behind her, not moving, not going back to the forge. "Faye," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the look she had been learning to read across 12 days of careful watching. The look that meant something was working its way up from a depth that had not been disturbed in a long time. His hands were at his sides. His jaw was not tight the way it was when he was closed. It was just still. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Any of it. He made a small gesture that encompassed the kitchen, the house, the yard, everything. The having someone, I forgot how." He paused. "I think I told myself I was better off forgetting." "And now," she said. He held her gaze. "Now I can't remember why I thought that." She set the kettle down. She crossed the kitchen and did the thing she'd been thinking about for several days, which was to take his right hand in both of hers the way she had once taken her father's hand when he was sitting in the wreckage of everything he'd tried to keep. Steadying. Simple. Present. He looked down at her hands. Then he looked up at her face. "Thomas would have liked me," she said. His breath caught, a single involuntary moment of it. Then something in his face that had been held rigid for a long time let go, not entirely, not all at once, but enough. Enough that she could feel the difference even just holding his hand. "He would have," Reid said. "He'd have talked to you for 5 hours straight, and then told me you were the best thing I'd ever managed to do right." She pressed his hand once and released it. "Then let's not prove him wrong." He reached up and put one hand against her face, brief, warm, rough with forge work and Wyoming weather, and years of holding everything alone. He let it fall. "I'm going to need time," he said. "I know that." "I know," she said. "I'm not in a hurry." He went back to the forge. She went back to the kettle, and the kitchen settled around her with the particular sound of a house in which someone has just said an important thing out loud for the first time. The land attorney's letter came 10 days later. The survey dispute had been received at the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and a preliminary review had found sufficient grounds to require the railroad to commission a corrected survey before any right-of-way claim could be enforced. The east pasture was theirs. Reid read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning, Blythe at his left in her good chair, Faye across from him with her coffee. He set the letter down and looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at his mother, and then at Faye. Blythe said, "Well," in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for things to go right, for long enough that right had almost stopped feeling possible. "Well," Reid agreed. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. That particular muscle had years of disuse to overcome, but the beginning of one. Present and unguarded. That evening, Dan Hughes came by the house for the first time in months. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and ate the apple cake Faye had made from the last of the autumn harvest, and he told a story about Reid at 19 that made Blythe laugh properly, for the first time Faye had heard. And Reid sat at the end of the table with an expression she was starting to understand was his version of contentment. Not loud, not demonstrated, just there. After Dan had gone and Blythe had gone to bed, Reid went to the mantle and picked up the compass. Faye was at the desk, writing a letter to her aunt in Cincinnati. She watched him without making it obvious. He turned the compass over in his hands, pressed his thumb against the glass face the way you touch something you have finally given yourself permission to touch. "Thomas gave this to me before Cold Harbor," he said. "He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the compass. Said I'd need it more than him because I never could find my way without a fixed point." She set down her pen. "He was right," Reid said. "For a long time I didn't have one." He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her across the room, and the lamplight was low between them, and the Wyoming night was holding the house in its cold, enormous hand. And in the middle of all of it, he looked at her with the entirety of what he hadn't managed to say in 4 years of silence. "I think I might have one now." Faye looked back at him. The fixed point of another person's attention, chosen, deliberate, offered without ceremony, was not a small thing. "Put the compass in your pocket," she said, "where it belongs." He did. The winter came hard that year the way Wyoming winters arrive, not gradually but all at once as if the sky had made a decision. The east barn roof held because Faye had organized the repair in October with a tenacity that Reid had observed with the same expression he'd worn when she first showed him the corrected accounts, the particular look of a man revising, in real time, what he thought he knew. She learned the forge work. Not all of it. She had no desire to replace Reid at the anvil, but enough to understand what he was doing, why it mattered, what it cost him, and what it gave him. She learned that he talked more easily when his hands were working, that the best time to ask him anything real was in the first hour of the morning, when the coffee was new and the day hadn't hardened yet. She learned the difference between the quiet that meant he needed space and the quiet that meant he needed company without the pressure of conversation. He learned her, too, that she read late and needed more lamp oil than he'd been buying, that she found the silence of the Wyoming landscape beautiful rather than oppressive, which surprised him, that she had buried her mother 2 years ago and her father the year before that, and that the grief had become part of the landscape of who she was, present and acknowledged, something she carried without being crushed by it. On a Sunday in February, he asked her to marry him properly. Not for the land, not for Blythe, not for the practical arrangements that had brought her here. He said it at the kitchen table after breakfast, with snow coming down outside and the compass in his breast pocket, where it had been every day for 3 months. And he said it in the plain, direct way he said all things that mattered to him. As a fact he had decided was true and didn't see any reason to complicate. She said yes in the same register. As a fact. As something she had known for a while and had been content to wait for him to reach. Blythe cried at the table, which she would later deny, and then asked for more coffee and told Reid he'd taken long enough, which he accepted without argument. In the spring, the land attorney wrote with the final ruling. The railroad's corrected survey placed the right-of-way east of the Larkin property line. 2 neighboring homestead owners who had filed their own disputes received similar rulings. The spur line would go around or not at all. Reid read the letter standing in the yard in the April morning light, then handed it to Faye. She read it, and they stood together in the door of the forge with the smell of new grass coming up from the pasture and the first warmth of a Wyoming spring pressing against the backs of their necks. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "You found something in a land survey that a railroad company's lawyers missed." "Their surveyors didn't look at the historical deed," she said. "They looked at the creek as it runs now. And you thought to check the difference." "I thought to look at what was actually there," she said, "not what the map said." He looked at her with that look, the steady, clear, unornamented look she had long since come to understand was the fullest expression of what Reid Larkin had to give. She had learned to receive it as what it was. Everything offered without ceremony, in the manner of a man who had finally stopped pretending he had nothing left to offer. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "All right," she said. "I wrote that letter because Dan told me the house was making me disappear," he said, "and because there was a practical need, and because the books needed someone. All of that is true." He paused. "None of that is why I'm glad you came." She waited. "I'm glad you came," he said, "because you looked at everything that was failing around here, and you didn't flinch, and you didn't flatter me, and you didn't pretend it wasn't failing. You just started working." He held her gaze. Nobody had done that since Thomas. She reached up and covered his hand on the forge doorframe with hers. "Thomas sounds like someone who knew what mattered," she said. "He did," Reid said. "So do you." The compass stayed in his pocket through all of it. The formal wedding in June, small and full of the right people. Blythe in her best dress, Dan with a clean shirt and an expression broadcast everything he was trying not to show. The land attorney from Cheyenne who said he'd never seen a homestead dispute won so cleanly and wanted to shake the hand of whoever had found the creek marker. The minister asked if anyone present had reason to object, and there was a silence in which everything that had almost gone wrong hung briefly in the air, and then it passed. And Reid took Faye's hand and made his promises in the flat, certain voice he used for facts. She made hers back. Outside, the Wyoming sky did what Wyoming skies do. It expanded beyond reason, blue and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the small, fierce particular lives being lived beneath it. Inside, the compass was in his pocket. The curtain hung in the window where someone had once put it with care, and the forge was burning, and the books were balanced, and Faye Colton, Faye Larkin, now, the name settling over her like something made specifically for her shoulders, sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to her aunt in Cincinnati that told the truth, which was that she had come to Wyoming expecting nothing specific and had found the only thing worth finding, a place that was hers, and someone to be in it with. She didn't have a single word for that yet. She thought she'd take her time finding one. The best words she had learned were the ones you earned.